So this is one description that kind of gives of the notion of the concept of explication. It says the task of making more exact a vague or not quite exact concept used in everyday life or in an earlier stage of scientific or logical development, or rather of replacing it by a newly constructed, more exact concept, belongs among the most important tasks of logical analysis and logical construction. We call this the task of explicating, or giving an explication for the earlier concept. The earlier concept of or sometimes the term used for it is called the explicandum. And the new concept or its term is called the explicatum of the older one, right? So it's important to keep in mind these two terms, explicandum and explicatum. I'll be using them throughout the talk. So then there's this very famous passage where Carnap explains what he understands, gives an example of conceptual engineering or explication in his case. When we compare the explicandum fish versus the explicatum pieces, we see that they do not even approximately coincide. What was the zoologist's motive for artificially constructing the new concept pieces, far remote from any concept in the pre-scientific language? The reason was that they realized the fact that the concept pieces promised to be much more fruitful than any concept more similar to fish. A scientific concept is the more fruitful, the more it can be brought into connection with other concepts on the basis of observed facts. In other words, the more it can be used for the formulation of laws. And I very much enjoyed listening to Nick talk about the inductive dimension of concepts, right? And I think that this idea of fruitfulness for Carnap is very much related to this, right? So concepts, can be better insofar as they lead to more predictions, right? To more inductive steps in this way. Okay, so for an explication to take place, Carnap recognizes that before you start the explication, you need to clarify the explicandum, right? So this is something that happens before the explication, properly speaking. And so he explains this idea in the following way. There's a temptation to think that since the explicandum cannot be given in exact terms anyway, it does not matter much how we formulate the problem. But this would be quite wrong. On the contrary, we must do all we can to make at least practically clear what is meant as the explicandum. And then he goes on, right? So he said, we can do all we can. So it seems like, we're going to have to do a lot of work to clarify the explicandum. But then he goes on to say, an indication of the meaning with the help of some examples for its intended use and other examples for uses not now intended can help the understanding. An informal explanation in general terms may be added. So actually, this is very little, right? I don't know if you agree with me, but this is just very superficial, right? In terms of understanding the explicandum, right? This doesn't seem to really get to the bottom of things. And this is exactly a point that was made by Eric Reck, who was, by the way, my co-author in one of my many Carnap papers. Actually, the first Carnap paper that I wrote was with Eric because I didn't feel like I knew enough about Carnap to write it on my own. So we teamed up, and I still like very much the way he thinks about Carnapian explication. So in an earlier paper, he said the following: it seems inadequate to handle the clarification of the explicandum by just providing a few examples, together with a rough and ready explanation. Much more attention to the context and the practices surrounding the examples seems called for. So this is my emphasis on context and practices here, right? So Eric describes Carnap's attitude towards the clarification of the explicandum as cavalier, right? It's a bit, in a sense, it's a bit, sloppy, you could even call it. And I agree. I think that you really need to do quite some work to clarify the explicandum before you even start conceptually engineering the concept. So to do this, so how do we do this? What I say in the paper is that Foucaultian genealogy is a very useful tool to formulate this clarification of the explicandum that is needed. And why is that? Why Foucaultian genealogy in particular? Because Foucaultian genealogy, unlike many other approaches to genealogy, is neither vindicatory nor subversive, right? So it presents itself as a neutral, having a neutral stance towards the object of analysis, Whereas so Nietzschean genealogy is typically subversive, right? It's debunking. Whereas you can also do genealogy, which is intended precisely to uh, 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 praise the object being analyzed. For example, knowledge, and you want to say, what a wonderful concept it is with a beautiful, distinguished story. Then in that case, the genealogy is indicatory. But Foucaultian genealogy aims to be explanatory and problematizing. And here, to my thinking about Foucault and genealogy is very much inspired by the work of Colin Copeman, who you see here, holding his book called Genealogy as Critique, which is I warmly recommend to anyone interested in Foucaultian genealogy. And here, the way Copeman describes like the gist of Foucaultian genealogy is the following. The crucial difference is that between showing that the present is contingent and showing how the present is contingently made up. So it's the how. You want the details of the processes through which a particular concept came to have the articulation that it currently has, right? It has undergone many stages along the way, right? And I like this kind of this Nietzschean model of layers of superposition, right? So new meanings are attributed, new functions are attributed to concepts, but it doesn't mean that the older ones have completely disappeared. Often they just stay there in kind of in a dormant state. So I think that's a very kind of helpful way to think about concepts. And so what is a genealogy? And here, before so I'm instead of using Foucault or somebody else as my let's say my speaker for genealogy, right? So I actually turned to Sally Heslanger, who has, I think, a very nice description of genealogy in general terms. So she says, very roughly, a genealogy of a concept explores its history, not in order to determine its true meaning by reference to origins, and not for sheer historicist fascination, but in order to understand how the concept is embedded in evolving social practices. So this is extremely important to me and to Foucault and to Sally. It's social practices, right? So these concepts are embedded in social practices. 2 points are crucial here. First, our concepts and our social practices are deeply intertwined. So concepts not only enable us to describe, but also help structure social practices, and our evolving practices affect our concepts. Second, there is often a significant gap between the dominant or institutional understanding of a domain and its actual workings. For example, in the interplay between concept and practice, developments on one side can get ahead or stubbornly resist the other. So Sally has this, at least in some circles, famous distinction between the operational notion, the operational dimension of a concept and the official version of it, right? So one is like the nominal definition, and the other one is how it actually, in fact, is deployed and the work it does in these social practices. And sometimes there are gaps between them. Okay, so now turning to Foucault again, right? So Foucault has himself presented genealogies of a number of interesting concepts, such as madness, medicine, punishment and prisons, sexuality, biopolitics, ethics, more or less in chronological order here. And an interesting thing is that, so like you might think like, why am I even talking about Foucault? Huh? What does Foucault have to do with Carnap anyway? There's like one interesting person, like there's an intersection between the two, and that's namely the work of Ian Hacking. So, right, so Ian Hacking has worked precisely on concepts that are dear to Carnap, such as the very concept of probability, using a Foucaultian methodology, right? So this is an example of somebody who has actually already done the kind of thing that I'm suggesting can be usefully also utilized for conceptual engineering. Right? So the work of Hacking, I think, is very illustrative of the possibility of combining these approaches. And so the key idea for our purposes here, for the purposes of conceptual engineering, is that genealogy can be used as a diagnostic tool, right? So the whole idea of conceptual engineering is that, well, here's a concept. We think that somehow this concept is defective, right? It's like not what we would like it to be. And so we want to improve it, right? But then we first need to understand what's wrong with it, right? We first need to, why is it defective? In which way should it be improved, right? Otherwise, we're just kind of like, sailing in the dark rather than knowing exactly what it is that we want to improve. Right? So what's the point of engineering if you don't have a more or less clear idea of what's wrong with the original concept in the first place? And this is what Foucault claims can be done with his genealogical approach. So here are two quotes from a famous essay by him on Nietzschean genealogy and history. He says, the genealogy must be able to diagnose the illnesses of the body, its conditions of weakness and strength, its breakdowns and resistances, to be in a position to judge philosophical discourse. Right? Of course, here using a metaphor for illness as the analogy of what would be wrong, right, with a particular concept or practice. Genealogy is an analysis of descent, is thus situated within the articulation of the body and history. So the medical metaphor is very pervasive in Foucault's work, as those of you who have read some Foucault, I'm sure, still remember. Right, so this idea of diagnosis, right? So it was, of course, a medical concept in and of itself, right? So you diagnose a disease in somebody's, body, and here in this case, the idea was that you can actually do something similar, diagnose what is wrong with the concept by applying this genealogical method. Okay, let me just check the time. So I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes. Yeah, well, let me skip this, right? So why genealogy is better than other historical alternatives? I can get back to this if people are interested. Let me move straight to the examples, because I think that's really to make it concrete, right? Otherwise, it's all very hand-wavy, perhaps. So I'll give you two examples here. One is the concept of logical form, which, as I said, is work that I've done myself. And the other is the concept and institution of marriage. So let me start with, right, so the work on the logical form is work that I did many years ago, but I still, and I back then when I was doing this work, I didn't think of it in terms of genealogy. What I was like, with hindsight, I look back and I realized that what I was doing all along is kind of Foucaultian genealogy, but I didn't think of it in these terms back then, right? So I was just studying the history of the concept of logical form. And the starting point is, of course, Aristotle, right? Because he's the one who introduced the very idea of hylomorphism in its metaphysical version, right? And metaphysical hylomorphism, as formulated by Aristotle, has a number of interesting features, right? So, which is like substantive presuppositions or aspects of the theory as developed by Aristotle. One is that form is unique. There's only one form. In a substance, there's form and there's matter, and there's only one form. Another one, and this is kind of controversial among the readers, the interpreters of Aristotle, but I think the majority agrees with this. They claim that the form-matter composite for Aristotle is understood in a non-mereological way. What does this mean? It means that form is not a proper part of the whole, right? Form is what articulates the different parts together. It's a principle of unity rather than a proper part of the composite. Another aspect of Aristotelian hylomorphism is a sharp and principled distinction between what is form and what is matter. Right, so there's no confusion there. And functionalism, right? So it's a very functionalist theory. And one way you could see this is that in many cases, formal causes and final causes coincide, right? So the form is at the same time the telos of the substance of the individual, of the substance. So this idea of functionalism, keep that in mind, right? Will be important for me later on. But what is very interesting is that Aristotle himself does not apply the form-matter distinction to logical objects, such as arguments, in any systematic way. There's one passage in the physics and a similar one in the metaphysics where he does that, like as examples, but otherwise he doesn't do it systematically, right? So John McFarlane in his dissertation says, well, Aristotle is the father of logic and he's the father of hylomorphism, but he's not the father of logical hylomorphism because he never brought the two things together himself, or hardly, right? Well, just with the exception of these two passages. And so what happened later, and this is a work that I've written about in a paper that appeared in the Journal of the History of Philosophy. So it's funny, Manuel, that you mentioned that I used to work on medieval logic, right? Which might not have been relevant for this talk, but as it turns out, it is, right? Because that's where my example is coming from. And so in this paper called Forma Matter in Latin Medieval Logic, because of supposition consequentia, there I describe the, scholarly details of this work that I've done. And what I describe in this paper is that the ancient commentators, for example, Alexander of Aphrodisia, they were the first ones to apply the form matter distinction specifically to arguments, right? And to syllogisms, like syllogistic arguments in particular. And then they said that the form of a syllogism is its figure, okay? The figure of a syllogism, it only has to do with the disposition of the terms in the argument, right? It does not pertain to the what we call the logical terms in the argument, right? So it doesn't pertain to the quantifiers or the negation. It's just the disposition of the terms. And this is, of course, not our current notion of logical form, right? And so initially, right, so I'm trying to, I'm sketching stages of development, right? So first there was no logical hylomorphism with Aristotle. Then there was a first version of logical hylomorphism with the ancient commentators. But there you don't have this idea that the logical form corresponds to actual words in the argument, right? Instead, it was just the disposition of the terms in the argument as such. And then with early Latin medieval authors, say in the 12th century, you see that the form of a syllogism can be either a figure or a mood, right? So then there's already a transition here. But now here there's an ambiguity, right? It can be either the figure or the mood. And the mood of a syllogism really is related to what we would call the logical form of a syllogism, right? To simplify. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but just to simplify the thought. And then later medieval authors, starting already in the 14th century, they thought that the form of a syllogism only pertained to its mood, and in particular to its syncategorematic terms. And the syncategorematic terms are what we call logical constants, right? So every, no, is, and all that. So you see the stages of transformation, right, that took place here. You start with Aristotle, and then you have the ancient commentators, the early Latin and medieval authors, and the later ones. And with the later authors, then you already have the notion of logical form, a notion of logical form that's very close to our own still now. But it didn't start out like this, right? And why, so and that's how I then go on to argue in this other paper called Reassessing Logical Hylomorphism and the Demarcation of Logical Constants. I argued that we should actually engineer, right, move away from a conception of logical form based on the notion of logical constants, right? So I didn't speak about this there in terms of conceptual engineering, but that's what I was doing there. I was saying, look, these days people talk about logical hylomorphism in terms of logical constants, but this is wrong. We shouldn't do this because we get into all kinds of issues. And one reason why we should change our notion of logical form is one of my arguments is historical, right? Is to show that it wasn't always like this, and in fact, that in this paper, I defend the view that we should go back to functionalism, which, as you may recall, is one of the features of Aristotelian hylomorphism in the first place. So in a way, my proposal there is to go back to something that's more Aristotelian than the current notion of logical form in metaphysical terms. And now I just quote something from that paper where I say, on a functionalist approach to logic, the first question to be asked is, what is the function of a valid argument? What is it that differentiates a valid from an invalid argument? A functionalist approach to logic may shift the focus away from the issue of a partition of the vocabulary into logical and non-logical expressions in favor of an analysis of deeper issues, right? So my concern there is that the whole idea of, being obsessed with a partition of vocabulary into logical and non-logical is a red herring. It was distracting us from the things that the real issues that we should be thinking about when thinking about logical arguments. And in fact, then from there I went on, as some of you know, to work on deduction more general, and then I wrote this book called The Dialogical Roots of Deduction, which in a way is exactly me analyzing the deeper issues pertaining to logic and deduction, right? So I took up my own challenge there and in my later work. And I never really bothered thinking about logical constants anymore. I mean, I still wrote like one paper or two on logical constants, and then I just don't anymore. In fact, sometimes I've been invited to write for volumes on logical constants, and I said I don't have anything to say because I don't even think it's an interesting topic. So anyway, but so that's how a genealogy of the concept of logical form then supported by a proposal for reformulation of the notion of logical form for, an instance of conceptual engineering of that concept. And now I'm going to talk about a different one, right, which is much more socially relevant, because logical form, let's face it, who cares, right? Other than us philosophers, nobody cares about that. But let's look at something that is societally relevant, and of course, the concept of marriage is extremely relevant because it permeates so many of our practices and institutions. And so the thought here is, of course, that since there have been discussions on legalizing same-sex marriage, and by the way, the Netherlands, my adopted country, isn't perfect, but at least we were the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. So I'm a little proud of that. Anyway, but when this happened, of course, this led to lively meta-linguistic disputes on what marriage even means, right? So people who oppose same-sex marriage say, well, you can't do this because it is part of the meaning of marriage that it involves a man and a woman. So how can you even have, same-sex marriage? It's like a contradiction in terms. And whereas other people are saying, no, the concept of marriage does not have at its core initially that, what the gender of the people involved. And so my claim is in this, that I develop in more detail in the paper, is that to explicate the concept of marriage, what we need is, of course, you have to have sustained engagement with the ordinary notions of marriage. And for this, you really need historical investigation. And one of the things that historical investigation will show you is that it's an extremely contingent institution anyway. It has already undergone many transformations across the centuries. So nothing says that, prior, like the people who claim that no, there should not be same-sex marriage because this is the definition of marriage. They're essentializing a notion that is, of course, historically contingent, right? And has undergone a lot of variations over the centuries. And so here, actually, Foucault himself has done a little bit of a genealogy of marriage. And in fact, this is one of the topics of the 4th volume of the History of Sexuality, which was just very recently published, right? The 3 first volumes were published with Foucault's own approval. And after that, he said he didn't want anything by him to be published posthumously. And so it took many, many years. And I think the English version of the English translation of volume 4 got published only this year, or maybe still to be published. So it's all very recent. And one of the things he says in this book is that it's only with the church fathers of the early Middle Ages that sex became seen as acceptable only in the context of marriage, right? And this is not something that you had in pagan antiquity, right? That marriage had the monopoly of sexual intercourse, right? That all sex taking place outside of marriage was to be, banned, preferably, or at least it was not to be tolerated, or at least worse than sex in the context of marriage. And this is really, and then related to this, ideals of virginity and chastity came to be seen as superior to marriage and to a active sexual life, right? So this is when you start having this idea within Christianity that monks and nuns, right, who make vows of chastity, they're somehow superior, right? They're morally higher. They stand morally in a morally higher place than the rest of us normal people who just get married and have an active sexual life. So this is all contingently, historically, these are historical developments, right? It wasn't always like this. And these are, I think, important historical transformations in the context of practices of marriage. And you might think, okay, why is this relevant for us now? But I think it is, right? Because we still have very much, concepts that are related to these then novelties, such as the concept of adultery, the concept of monogamy, right? The very concept of adultery is sex outside of outside of wedlock. I mean, before what the early church fathers did, this wasn't even, you couldn't even conceptualize the idea of adultery in this way. And the same thing with monogamy and etc. Right? So there's traces of these transitions are still with us. And just to conclude the example here, there is a work that I find extremely interesting on the concept of marriage by Elizabeth Brake. And I do think it can be described as an instance of conceptual engineering. This is not how she describes it, but it seems to me an excellent example of conceptual engineering of the notion of marriage. So she proposes, right, the idea of minimal marriage. In this concept, the concept privileges the component caring relationship over all other presumed components of marriage. So that's all that matters for marriage, is a caring relationship. So there are also no restrictions. There's no restrictions on the gender of people involved, but also not on the number of people involved. You can have a marriage of 3 or 4 people, right? If they are bound by a caring relationship with each other. And as there are also no specific restrictions on the kinds of spousal obligations involved. So the notion of minimal marriage also does not privilege sex as a component of marriage. So I find this very interesting, right? So that's why it's minimal. It just really sticks to one core component, namely the notion of caring relationship. And Brake justifies this move, right? The introduction of this concept in what I think can be seen as Carnapian terms, right? In a sense, she says that, well, this conception would counter what she calls a metanormative discrimination, right? So traditional conceptions of marriage discriminate against people who have caring relationships of other kinds. And she says, well, if we have a minimal notion, we're not going to, this is not going to be a problem for anyone who likes the traditional notion of marriage and practices, right, the traditional notion of marriage. That's fine. They will still, this is still going to be called marriage, but it comes to include many more arrangements that now do not receive the seal of approval, right, with the name marriage, and which of course has implications, so tax implications, healthcare implications, all kinds of practical implications as well. So I like this proposal very much, and I think again, could be construed as an example of conceptual engineering, in this case by making the concept thinner, right, as in like having fewer components, and thereby of course it ends up being applicable to more phenomena. Okay, so just to conclude, and oh, by the way, to be honest, again, Brake herself does not engage in the kind of genealogical analysis that I recommend here, but I think it goes quite well with, if you think about a marriage historically and you see that it's been through so many different instantiations already, then you could say, then why not now just, move to yet a different conception of marriage, which will have a number of advantages. The contingency of the institution is, of course, made very salient by a historical analysis that shows its development. All right, so to conclude, genealogy can be fruitfully combined with explication because, right, as I claimed, because it may remedy a lacuna pertaining to the preliminary stage of clarification, right? So the understanding the explicandum in the first place. It can help clarify current uses of the explicandum, right? Because these current uses are arguably a consequence of these historical developments and the associated practices. Even if there have been transformations, often there will still be traces of these prior instantiations of the concept that we still kind of uncritically accept, right? So it's often like something that you don't even stop to think about. It also highlights the contingency and historicity of concepts. And it brings to the fore the idea of functions of a given concept, right? Because this is really very much a focus of genealogy that was understood, that you really don't look at the concept in isolation, right, as some sort of freestanding entity. You're interested in concepts insofar as they are deeply, closely related to practices, in the way that Sally Haslinger, for example, describes in that passage that I read a few minutes ago. And this will in turn facilitate the formulation of a fruitful explication, right? One that's actually going to have some sort of practical impact, right? Rather than some, arbitrary proposal that is not going to latch on to the, practical implications that you're really interested in. And then just to finalize, I want to draw some considerations on the broader implications of genealogy and explication, the analysis I've proposed here, for conceptual engineering more generally. And this view, right, this take on conceptual engineering that I'm presenting here, that I espouse myself, really belongs to a particular strand of conceptual engineering, which can be described as a pragmatist functionalist strand of conceptual engineering. And I think Amy Thomason is one of the main representatives of this approach. I think Sally Haslanger can also be seen as doing that kind of, right, the kind of functionalist conceptual engineering, pragmatist conceptual engineering. So the general point is that anyone who takes function and practices to be a fundamental component of conceptual engineering will profit from engaging with genealogy, because genealogy recommends exactly that: attention to practices and their relations to concepts. And that, in particular, those interested in political and societal implications of engineering concepts, on top of everything, will also benefit from engaging with Foucault, because Foucault is, of course, the philosopher of power, right? Who's the person, the thinker who has spent perhaps the most time and pages writing about the very notion of power and relations of oppression. So that too, I think, is a benefit for, say, let's say, societally relevant conceptual engineering to be undertaken. I think, we have much to learn from that too. And that's what I had to say today. So here I have a few pictures. Here on the left, it's Carnap talking to Russell, and on the right, it's Foucault. I think I forgot where he was here, but he was some sort of activist context, right? So Foucault was not just a thinker, but he was also an activist, and was very active, and he practiced what he preached to some extent. So, and I think that's also something for us to keep in mind, right? So when engaging in conceptual engineering, is that ultimately what we want, at least some of us, is also to have to obtain practical consequences, both for practices, say, within philosophy, science, but also beyond. Thank you.